Today is all about creating dramatic black and white men's portraits, and I'm going to show you how I do it with 1, 2, or 3 lights. Hey everybody, Lindsay Adler here. I am known for creating really glamorous, dramatic women's portraits, but when I photograph men, I bring the drama as well. And so that's what we're going to be doing today. I want to show you how you can use 1 light, 2, or 3 in a relatively small space to create images that are really sculpted and pop off of the page. For our first setup, I'm going to use just a single light, and we'll take a look at how I craft and sculpt that light to create drama and separation. Then, when I add a second strobe, it gives me the flexibility to have a high key background so I can have something that is really dramatic and all about contrast. And last but not least, I'm going to introduce some specialty modifiers when we move over to 3 strobes. So with that, let's start with our first setup. For this setup, I'm going to be using a 3-foot Octabox, and right now it is centered relatively flat onto the subject. I want to show you where we start before we introduce drama to the scene. It is both the black and white conversion and the sculpting of shadows that's going to make this image more interesting. Now, for the images today, I'm going to be shooting with the Canon R5 Mark II and the Canon RF 70-200 2.8 lens. This is a great portrait lens, and it's going to allow me to get some really beautiful close-up shots, especially when I'm sculpting the light. So let's begin with the light as it is. All right, so here's what I see in this setup. Not much. It's not super interesting light. There's a lot of light falling on the background, the subject. There's not much shadow, but I will say converting it to black and white makes quite a difference. So I'm over here in Capture One. I'm going to convert to black and white, and then I'm going to pop the contrast. And you can already see that a lot of the tonalities get richer. But I do think that the background is quite competitive. I keep looking at the background instead of my subject. And I think the light on the face is still a little bit flat. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this light and I'm going to move it around to the side. As I move it off the center axis from camera, that is going to introduce more shadow to the side of the subject's face. Now there's no right or wrong answer for this, but the further I move it off to the side, the more and more dramatic it will become. Eventually, if I move that light so far off to the side, it would actually become more of a rim light. So I'm going to move it, and let's take another shot to see the drama I've introduced. So definitely a lot more dramatic, and I love the richness of the shadows on this side of the face. However, once again, the background is still distracting to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to feather my light. I'm going to change the angle. Right now it's pointed at the subject and also the background, but I'm going to angle it across the scene, and you're going to notice the background becomes darker and richer and therefore more dramatic. For me, that is significantly more interesting already. But what I am watching out for is I want to make sure that the shadow side of the face does not blend in with the background. So I should not have a dark black shadow against a dark black background. Otherwise, I lose a lot of dimension in the frame. So that's mostly when I'm paying attention as I'm feathering my light. Now, one of the reasons that it's so important to shoot tethered is because when I pop the contrast, shadows will get darker, they'll get heavier. And so I actually want to be able to visualize it, see it, and see how my conversion is making a difference in the final shot. Now, I do think the shot would be fine like this, but I do want more attention to go to his eyes. So I'm going to introduce one more variable. I'm going to bring in a silver reflector, and I'm going to do so it bounces just a little bit into the shadows. I don't want it to flatten out the shot, but what I'm looking for is just a little more sparkle to the eyes. Now, in a shot like this, I have my light feathered across the scene, which means most of the light is heading that direction. So I want to pay very close attention to where I place my reflector, making sure some of the light is actually bouncing. With such a feathered light, it can be pretty precise. This is why it's so important to use modeling lights, because modeling lights are going to allow you to visualize and actually see what's happening with the bounce of your strobe. So I'm going to introduce a silver reflector, and this is just a piece of the Manfrotto triflector. So this is a reflector holder that allows you to hold up to 3 reflectors at once, but I'm just going to be using a single silver reflector. All right, so the biggest difference you'll see in this shot is there are now brighter catchlights in the bottom of his eyes, and that side of the face lightens up just a little bit. But you'll notice that the reflector is closer to the light source rather than on the far side of the face. And the reason I did that is if I move the reflector over to this side, so the right-hand side of the frame, it would actually fill in the shadows. And I like the richness of the shadows here. It sculpts the jaw and the side of the face. So the position of the reflector actually makes a huge difference in the end result. All right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a couple shots here, and because this is meant to be dramatic, I'm going to go for more dramatic expressions or poses, a furrowed brow, and maybe I'll move that main light just a little bit to make it a little bit more or less dramatic. All right, so let's grab the shot. All right, moving on to adding a second strobe. We're going to switch out our main light and we're going to switch to a modifier that is a little bit harder and more crisp. Rather than a 3-foot Octabox, which can create quite a soft quality of light close to the subject, we're going to go for a harder modifier called a magnum reflector. Magnum reflector is going to create a sunny, more specular quality of light, more contrast and texture to the skin. Plus, we've added a grid, which means this background is going to appear pure black. It's going to give us a lot of drama, even though the position of the light is in relatively the same position. So let's take a shot. You can see just how much more defined the shadow edges are on the cheekbone, the jawline, even the shadows underneath the brow. And of course, the background, even though it's gray, it appears pure black. But I did this on purpose. I wanted this drama and contrast because we're going to actually add our second strobe to separate the subject out from the background by illuminating it to be white. Now, when I introduce a second light into the scene, I have so many choices of what it could do. For example, with this shot, I could add it as a rim light for separation, a hair light up top. I could also add it as a fill light in the front, but here I want to play around with shape. That's another reason that we have a robe placed on our subject's shoulders, because we can create a little color, a little bit more theatricality to the shot. So the light that we have is actually a bare strobe behind the subject on a floor stand. Now, of course, if you wanted to go through the effort, I could switch the background to be a white background, but it's not going to be a problem. I can simply turn up the power of the light and overexpose the background so it appears white. Plus, with my black and white conversion, I've bumped up the contrast so much, the background is going to be able to go to a nice clean white easily. All right, so let's add our second strobe. All right, so you can see now the background is pure white and I love the contrast. I intentionally have the shadows on the side of the face and the jacket, everything go to pure black because it makes really graphic and interesting shapes. And I could 100% shoot the image just like this, but there's a couple more things I'm considering. One thing is the posing. Right now with his chin down, there are dark shadows in the eyes. I could go with this. You don't always have to have catchlights, or I could position the chin up towards the light just a little bit more. I could come in and add a reflector. That's an option. But because my main light has a grid on it, it's going to be really difficult to bounce enough light into the eyes to create a catchlight. I think what I'm actually going to do for this shot is lean into the sculpting just a little bit more. And so how I'm going to do that is I'm actually going to block a little bit of light off of the highlight side of the face. So right now we have a ton of shadow over here, really dark, deep shadows. Highlights on this side, but maybe I want to add just a little more shadow here. Now there are specialty modifiers that will allow you to do that, but what we're going to do is actually introduce something called a flag. And fundamentally, a flag is a piece of black fabric or duvetine, or it could even be just a piece of cardboard, but a flag blocks light. That is its entire intention. So I'm going to bring it in and we're just going to create a little shadow on the side of the face, which means there's a tighter pocket of light on the center of the face. All right, so let me introduce the flag. All right, so the difference you'll see now is over here on this side of the frame, the left-hand side is just a little bit more shadow on the face. And if the goal of creating these images is to create drama, then more shadow is going to help us do that. Now, you'll notice when I introduce the flag, it is pretty close to the subject. And one of the things to keep in mind is when you're trying to create a shadow, especially if you want a dark, crisp shadow, the closer the flag is to the subject, the more defined that shadow edge will be. All right, so this is fundamentally the setup that I want to work with. So in order to shoot this, what I'm going to try to do is try different expressions, different angles, play around with the shape of the shoulders. All right, let's get the shot. For our last setup, we are going to be using 3 lights. Now, here's what I think about as I think about building in a set. When I have one light, that first light sets the mood of the scene, the quality of light, the amount of sculpting to that light. When I add a second light, I can use that light for separation, either lighting the background, a rim light, or a fill light. But when I add 3 lights, that's when I can start mixing and matching things. I can have a main light, a background light, and a fill light, a main light, a rim light, and a hair light. There are so many different possibilities. So for this last set, what I'm going to do is I'm going to introduce some creative modifiers, and we will have a main light, a background light, and a fill light. Now the creative modifier I'm going to be using is the Westcott optical spot. Now the reason this is one of my go-tos when I'm trying to create dramatic light is that it allows me to create really tight slices of light. I can put just a strip of light across the eyes or down the center of the face. I can make this a little bit more of a diffused edge, or I can make it razor sharp. So I'm going to build in these lights one by one, and we'll begin with our main light and that optical spot. The drama this gives me is just so beautiful. It looks like he's stepping into a slice of light, almost like sunlight coming in through an open doorway. I have softened the edge of the lens, so even though it's a pocket of light, I'm not seeing literally a sharp line on the face. Now, of course, when I do this, when I restrict the light so much, everything else falls to shadow. There's no separation, there's no depth, and I think really dramatic photos will have a level of separation. So that's where our background light is going to come into play, and I'm going to use another optical spot. Now, by the way, the optical spots, you can actually select different lenses that change the spread of light. So on the main light, I have a 150mm lens. This is one of them that you can get through Westcott, and that is for tighter, more beauty and headshots. For our second light, I am using the 50mm lens. This allows a greater coverage of light, which is perfect if I'm trying to illuminate a background. Now, built into the optical spot, there are also these shutters that you can open and close. That's how I've created the slice of light on the face. And also, we're going to create a beam of light across the background with the same technique. Now, the reason I've chosen this is it's going to give me a graphic element, a lot of contrast, so it's going to make the photo just a little bit more interesting. All right, so let's add the background light. All right, so there is a ton of contrast going on here, and you can see even though the background is still gray, because we've overexposed that background light, it actually appears white when we've created that graphic slice. Now there is one more trick I want to show you, and I did this on purpose. Can you see that there's a little bit of light on his jawline, even the side of his face? It looks like I have another light in there already. But actually what I'm doing is I'm using a defect or a downside of the optical spot to my advantage. So the way the optical spot works is that lens is separated just a little bit from the body of the modifier, and this is to allow the heat to escape. What that means is a little light does leak out. In this case, I positioned it by using the modeling light, seeing the light so that it becomes a rim light. So even though I am only going to be using 3 lights in this set, it actually will look like 4. And of course, if you don't want that spill, you can position it someplace else, or you could use a piece of cinefoil, which is basically black tin foil, attach it to the side of the light and use it to block that spill. All right, so what would I do with a third light here? Well, if I didn't have the spill from the optical spot, I could add another strong rim light. I could have done that. But in this case, what I think would make the picture just a tiny bit more interesting would be a little bit more definition to the shadows. Right now, there is a lot of black on the background, black on the clothing and in the beard. So by adding just a little bit of fill, I'll be able to have a little more depth, a little bit more separation. The picture will just have a little bit more detail to it. So my very last light is over here to the right-hand side of the frame. It is a fill light, and I'm just using a medium umbrella with diffusion. What that'll do is it'll lift up the shadows, almost like dragging the shadow slider in Adobe Camera Raw, and it's going to give me a little bit more detail. So let's turn on that light and take a look. And the other reason I like this so much is if I want more fill, I turn it up. Less fill, I turn it down. In this case, if I had a reflector, there is not any bounce light that I could actually capture. So if I want fill, a strobe is a must. So now you can see that there is a lot more detail to the shadow side of the face. It does not fall to complete shadow, which I think makes the image a little bit more interesting. But if I do want it to be a little darker and more dramatic, I simply turn down the power of the strobe. All right, so I love what this looks like. I love the specularity to the skin. I'm gonna go get the shot. What does dramatic mean? What does drama in a portrait mean? For me, it's a combination of things. A lot of times it's using shadow. It's creating drama in the expression. It's having contrast. It's showing detail. And so whether I'm using 1, 2, or 3 lights, I'm considering these things. And when I'm using a single strobe, I have to be very careful on exactly how I sculpt the light, because it's the only thing determining the separation in a scene. But when I add that second light, then I have the opportunity to add a rim light or illuminate the background. And then of course, with 3, you can tell I have so much flexibility. So which one do you like best? The first one is a little bit more classic. The second one has a little bit more of a pop and a graphic nature, and the third one is a little bit more modern. So if you guys want to see the gear that I use to make these 3 images, be sure to check out the links in the description below. And if you pick up this gear, be sure to visit Adorama.com. Thanks everyone for watching, and I'll see you next time.